This is Stephen Janis reporting for the Real News Network in Baltimore City, Maryland. In just 3 days, the trial of Cesar Goodson begins, one of 6 officers charged in the death of Freddie Gray. But on the eve of the trial, questions are being asked about the fairness of the justice system and the implicit bias it seems to have for police officers. This trial is probably the biggest of all the cases. What does the prosecution have to prove to get to the level of depraved heart murder in this particular, because that is the most serious charge that's been leveled in the entirety of the Freddie Gray trials?
Well, let me begin by saying that any conviction would represent a historic moment in the history of prosecuting police officers, because in the past 10 years, my research shows there's only been 4 officers that have been found guilty and sustained on appeal throughout the country, with nearly 10,000 people being killed from police officers in the line of duty. So while we look at the most serious charge, I would say that a conviction in and of itself would represent something very different than what usually happens. But for depraved indifference, the prosecution would have to convince the judge beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant, in this case Officer Goodson, the driver, was aware of the serious risk of death or of serious physical injury to someone whom he's transporting in his van, who's cuffed and shackled and has no means of protecting himself when he goes crashing into the wall of the van. And if he had that kind of information, knew that others had been paralyzed or otherwise seriously injured, and left Freddie Gray in that situation on his own volition, then you're facing a situation where basically what the defendant would be saying is, I don't give a damn what happens to you.
Well, how do you think, the van made multiple stops, roughly 5. How do you think that fits into that sort of argument? The fact that they kept stopping the van and checking on him would be evidence in some ways that they weren't really concerned about his condition, that they were knowledgeable of his condition, or at least Officer Goodson was, and then didn't fail to act on it. Does that at all play into that case in terms of the evidence?
If we had evidence that showed that Officer Goodson was concerned about Freddie Gray and was stopping the vehicle to get assistance to help him, then of course it would be very consistent with a strong defense that he was not aware and engaged in some risky conduct, but rather was trying to be helpful. It's just, see, right now, Steve, the problem is that we don't know the evidence. So I'm going to suggest that the prosecution bring in evidence about these rough rides that would allow the fact finder, in this case a judge, not a jury, but would allow the judge to conclude that the driver, the defendant, was well aware of how much risk he left Freddie Gray in, the vulnerable condition, and that he basically just consciously disregarded that. I also expect that, what usually happens in these kinds of cases is that the defendant or the defendant's lawyers will shift responsibility to a different officer, probably a officer of higher rank. Like Lieutenant Rice, more than even probably the sergeant, but might be under orders from Lieutenant Rice, or might feel that he had no choice but to follow the order.
We know today that Officer Goodson has requested a bench trial, that is a judge, and he is the second officer to do that since William Porter had a jury trial. What's the strategy behind asking a judge to be your ultimate decider? What's the pros and cons of that?
Well, it's a very common strategy that police officers use in the rare situations when they're brought to trial. And again, my research indicates that it's been a successful strategy time and time again. And so what you're doing is something that the ordinary defendant would never do. The ordinary defendant, who for the most part is going to be young, poor, and a person of color, African American or Latino, is going to rest hope with 12 people from the community. And the hope will be that one or more of those jurors will question the government's case and will have a reasonable doubt. So when you're avoiding the community and deciding to put your full hope with one person, a judge, you've got to have a pretty good idea that the judge is going to be sympathetic to your cause.
Right, but doesn't that suggest an implicit bias in the judiciary being favorable towards police officers?
I don't think there's any question in my mind that a trial of a police officer defendant is much different than the trial of the ordinary low-income or poor person who's accused of a crime. I only wish, frankly, that the entire system would care as much about the rights of the accused for the typical person on trial as it does for the special or unusual defendant who's on trial.
The prosecution so far has had a mistrial and an acquittal. If they don't win at least one of these convictions in this case, what are the implications for the subsequent trials looking down the road?
Well, I do think that the mistrial represents a real victory for the prosecution. I know that sounds strange because usually mistrials are victory for the defense. But the fact that Officer Porter came within one vote or 3 votes on 2 of the 4 charges, he came that close to being convicted on 2 criminal charges. I think that factored into Officer Goodson's decision to go with a judge rather than a jury. I think that the defense certainly hopes that the court, the judge, will reach a similar ruling as it did for Officer Nero, and they're probably concerned that ordinary people are going to be very much affected by the notion that a 25-year-old man died as a result of the officer's, I'm saying collectively, the officer's involvement here.
You raise a great question, which is, given the fact that a healthy man, before he's in police custody, ends up dead at the end of his, at the end of a van ride. Yet there's this tremendous amount of backlash about trying to hold someone accountable for someone whose death, who they are supposedly legally responsible for his safety. Why is it? Why do we keep hearing all this pushback about what Marilyn Mosby's trying to do being somehow untoward, given the fact that this man died?
Yeah, and I've always given a great deal of credit to the state's attorney's office for following the evidence and bringing the charge and allowing transparency to allow all of us to be seeing and hearing what happened to Freddie Gray. And that's something that's quite unusual for a local prosecutor to show that determination. The backlash takes place because of examining who is the victim here, who is the person who died in the back of that van. If that was someone that we knew, Steve, if that was someone who, God forbid, was our child or somebody that we knew, that 25-year-old, there would not be a question in the world that from our point of view, that the police had a duty to protect and that person who's in custody. I really feel that you cannot take away the issue of race and racism in terms of how the pushback shows so much understanding and sympathy for the police officer's job, but very little. It's almost being lost here in terms of the concern for the life of a person, who's African American and who comes from a poorer community, and yet that seems to get lost here. What we keep reading about in the newsprint is always the concern for the officers. And I'm a strong believer in the rights of the accused and protecting people's right to a fair trial. But in this situation, you have to look at this particular allegation historically. And you really have to look at the legal system's failure to protect the lives of African American people throughout our history. And it's not to say that that's exactly what's happening here, but that's where a local prosecutor is giving at least the opportunity to learn what happened and hopefully to see whether or not the evidence supports a conviction. If it doesn't support a conviction, then the officer should be found not guilty. But if it does, then that's where there's a great deal of pressure now on this individual judge to find someone guilty.